No, I didn't embezzle the company's money, I said, picking up the phone call from my father. The first thing I heard was his booming voice, making my ears ache. How on earth am I supposed to embezzle the company's money when I've retired? You're way off base, I calmly replied to my father, sensing his tone cooling somewhat. But I do know who the embezzler is, he shouted again, his flustered voice audible over the phone. Who is it? Name the criminal, my father demanded, his voice getting louder. The one who's been using the money is. I paused, mentioning the name. My father seemed caught off guard, completely speechless. My name is Henry Hawkins. I have been working in the accounting department of my father's company for 8 years now, I explained. I have a brother, Bob, who's often called Mr. Perfect due to his talent and looks. I've always been compared to Bob and lived in his shadow since childhood, I continued, reflecting on my life. Despite my efforts, my parents always favored Bob for his exceptional talent. Even when I earned achievements, they seemed overshadowed by Bob's presence. Growing up, I yearned for my parents' love, but it always seemed to elude me, I added, recounting the struggles. Eventually, I accepted that I would never match up to Bob's achievements. So, I tried to find solace in living a relatively free life away from their high expectations. However, my path was already decided. I had to join the family business. I sighed, explaining my predicament, not because of my abilities, but simply because I was a family member. Even if I was considered less competent than Bob, supporting the family business was mandatory. Initially, working in the accounting department was peaceful, I recalled, but when Bob took over as president, everything changed. It's a nuisance if you interfere in my management, he would say. I never intended to meddle. I only wanted what was best for the company. As I tried to speak up, I continued, frustration evident. Bob smirked and dismissed me, labeling me as incompetent. Incompetence gets in the way, Henry. So please leave. The phone call with my father left me conflicted. Between family expectations and my own aspirations, the tensions only seemed to grow. I was on the verge of saying a lot of things, but when I heard those words, my will to argue vanished completely. Reluctantly, I agreed to leave the company. Oh, I'm relieved you understand your own incompetence, Henry, Bob taunted as I packed my belongings. Being a CEO seems quite leisurely, doesn't it? You're the one who said I should leave, so once I do, never get involved with me again. Ha, of course I'm the one saying no to you. Don't come crying to me when you're in a financial pinch, Henry, Bob replied with a smirk. Leaving the company felt forced, but I wasn't attached to it. Instead, a strange relief washed over me knowing I could finally move on. Finding a new job took longer than expected. I suspected Bob had been pressuring related companies. Despite the difficulty and time it took, I eventually found a job that brought me satisfaction. It's not a big company, but the people here are warm and kind, I reflected. No one sees me as an inferior elder brother, as they did in my previous job. Have you gotten used to the work? A woman peered into my face as I focused on the computer, showing a kindly smile. She was Sonia Smith, the CEO's daughter of this company. Despite the stereotype of a CEO's daughter being arrogant and pampered, Sonia was nothing like that. Though clearly doted on by her father, she was considerate and caring, even showing concern for me, a newcomer. Yes, thanks to you, I replied with a smile, watching Sonia return to her seat. Thanks to Sonia's care, I began to feel more settled in my new role. I quickly bonded with my new colleagues, and within a few months of switching jobs, my relationship with Sonia had also grown deeper. We often have dinner at a nearby restaurant if we finish work at the same time, I noted, contrasting these interactions with the impersonal atmosphere at my father's company. It was a refreshing change. One day, enjoying my current work-life balance, my smartphone rang unexpectedly. I had finished work early and was thinking of relaxing at home when I saw a familiar name on the display, Bob. I hesitated, tempted not to answer, but knowing he'd persist, I reluctantly picked up. Hello, brother. You're slow to answer, aren't you? Managing well with that new job? Bob's voice was casual, as if lounging around even through the phone. What do you want? I cut to the chase, eager to end the call. Why would I call you someone I've supposedly cut ties with? Bob continued, his tone falsely calm, but I could sense his smugness. There's a woman named Sonia Smith at your company, isn't there? He asked abruptly. I met her at a party recently. She struck me as a good and modest lady, thought I might get closer to her. I felt momentarily speechless. Bob's intentions were clear, though his voice feigned calmness, masking his underlying smirk disgustingly. I couldn't see his expression over the phone, but I could easily imagine it. "Don't tell me you're asking me to mediate between you two," I asked incredulously. "You're surprisingly perceptive, brother. That's helpful," Bob replied smoothly. I felt an impulsive urge to hang up right then, but somehow I held back, took a deep breath, and calmly opened my mouth. "Didn't you have a girlfriend who was the daughter of another company's president?" I probed. "I remember when I was working elsewhere, around the time you were becoming president, you were engaged to the daughter of a collaborating company." Though I hadn't spoken to her, I'd heard she suited Bob's personality well. As much as Bob was adored, I couldn't believe his father would approve of him having two girlfriends simultaneously. I continued, raising my concern. Bob's response was weary. "Oh, that woman. Her company's in financial trouble. I broke up with her to avoid any trouble for myself." It was a typical story for Bob. Despite being engaged, he cleanly severed ties due to her financial difficulties. Some might see it as a pragmatic approach to a political marriage, but it was something I couldn't support. "Even though we're in the same company, she's the president's daughter. She's not just anyone," I emphasized firmly. Casually chatting with Bob was easy, but mediating between him and Sonia was out of the question. Despite seeing each other daily and dining together several times a week, I foresaw trouble if I admitted this to Bob, so I politely declined, making up excuses. "Well, that makes sense. It's impossible for a regular employee like you, bro." Bob surprisingly accepted my refusal. The call ended somewhat smoothly that day, but soon after, I began receiving frequent calls from him. Each time he called, Bob insisted, "You're at the same company. You should find some common ground if you try." Finding it ridiculous, I denied his request and hung up, growing increasingly annoyed with each repetitive call. Then calls from my father started coming, not about work, but about Bob. I thought I wasn't involved anymore. I muttered as my father explained. "Bob mentioned you know Miss Smith well. We need your help to deepen her relationship with Bob." As a child, I'd yearned for such validation from my parents, but now it only irked me. "I can't do that," I responded tersely, feeling only annoyance listening to my father's reasoning. I ended the call abruptly without saying more. One day, amidst the persistent calls from Bob and my parents, Sonia invited me to dinner after work. To be honest, I was grateful for Sonia's invitation, as it provided a welcome respite from the persistent calls from my parents. We decided to dine at our usual nearby restaurant. Once the food arrived, Sonia looked troubled as she began to speak. "Have you been in touch with your brother lately?" she asked, her concern evident. I had previously shared with Sonia about my family dynamics and why I had changed jobs. Despite knowing I wasn't on good terms with Bob, her sudden question left me uneasy. "Did my brother do something?" I inquired cautiously. "Well, yeah," Sonia admitted. "I guess there was an incident. Bob mentioned they met at a party." I felt a twinge of discomfort hearing this, but the immediate issue was Bob's persistent calls and the possibility he might be disrespecting Sonia. As I voiced my concern, Sonia peered intently at me. "Oh, what?" I asked, thrown off guard. "You don't look much like brothers, do you?" Sonia observed, her words stirring childhood memories. "The younger one is outstanding, but the older brother is not so much," she continued, reflecting on the differences between us. "They don't look like brothers at all." These words echoed sentiments I had heard repeatedly from various people, a reflection of the stark contrast between Bob's success and my more modest achievements. Unpleasant memories flashed through my mind, memories of similar comments from my parents and others. But I brushed them aside, focusing on Sonia's advice. "If you're open to advice," she suggested gently, "you should consider distancing yourself from Bob." I knew it wasn't my place to interfere, but I felt compelled to speak up. Since changing jobs, Sonia had been kind to me, and I didn't want her to be unhappy. That's why I spoke, but to my surprise, Sonia responded, "I feel the same way." She smiled warmly and took a sip of water. "I'm not particularly interested in getting close, but my father is concerned." "Hey, do you know a secret?" she whispered conspiratorially. I was taken aback, but I replied cautiously, "Is it related to what I know?" "Who knows? It might be a different story," she replied with a smug smile. Several weeks after our dinner together, my phone rang. It was my father. Our contacts had been sparse lately, so I assumed he was too busy to deal with me. "Hello, Dad," I can't mediate. I started, but before I could continue, he cut in sharply. That's not why I called today. Have you embezzled money from our company? His sudden accusation caught me off guard, and his yelling stunned my ears. I briefly considered shouting back, but I understood the gravity of the situation. How could I, having resigned, embezzle company money? That's a ridiculous accusation, I retorted, trying to keep my composure. Well, but my father's voice faltered, then calmed somewhat. I sighed heavily, steeling myself for what I had to say. But I know who the embezzler is. What? Who is it? My father's voice rose again, demanding the culprit's name. His authoritative tone intensified the ache in my ears, but I knew I couldn't delay any longer. It's Bob, I stated firmly. What did you say? When I uttered Bob's name, my father was completely speechless, caught off guard as if he hadn't anticipated this at all. It's not surprising he chose the younger son, Bob, who is more competent, to be the CEO of the company. I began, reflecting on the situation, but I never expected that Bob would be embezzling company funds. I had become aware of this while still working in the accounting department. Initially, the amounts were small, easily overlooked, but they grew bolder over time. Before I knew it, a substantial sum had been embezzled, and the only person who could have done it was Bob, now CEO. There's no future for the company at this rate, I thought grimly. It's on the brink of collapse. Bob must have realized that I knew about his embezzlement, which is why he forced me to quit abruptly. I continued, anticipating my father's disbelief. If you look at the accounting documents I left, it'll become clear. Do you want to see the evidence I've gathered? I'm prepared to sever ties, but I kept copies of everything for a reason. My father, who moments ago had said he couldn't believe it, fell silent at my words. But that's not all, I pressed on. The money he embezzled is being used for an affair with a married woman. A married woman? My father's voice shifted from surprise to utter exhaustion. This was news to me as well, I admitted. Sonia told me about it during one of our dinners together. The CEO, who cares deeply for his daughter, found out and is furious with Bob, especially since he's always around Sonia. At this rate, the company is headed towards bankruptcy, I concluded, knowing this was likely the first time my father was hearing the full extent of the situation. I heard a weak voice from my father, and I listened silently as he spoke. Can you help me out with some funds? Can you talk to the president of your company for me? If we can form a partnership with the Smith Group, we can turn our company around. He sounded as if he had just come up with a brilliant idea. In reality, I knew that partnering with the Smith Group was likely the only way to save our struggling company. Yet as my father asked for help over the phone for the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of indifference. I'm sorry, but I can't, I replied calmly. I've already severed ties with all of you. What? My father's voice rose in disbelief, but I ended the call before he could finish his sentence. After that, my father and Bob called me repeatedly, but I blocked their numbers, finally freeing myself from the constraints of my family. It felt even more liberating than I had imagined. In the end, Bob went bankrupt not long after. He was left with debts, and my parents, who had always treated me as incompetent, were now being pursued for repayment. Do you ever worry about your family? Sonia asked curiously as we shared a pasta dinner after work. Since that incident, I felt closer to Sonia than ever. We spent almost every day together now, and I knew I needed to gather courage soon. No, I'm fine, I replied with relief. I'm relieved to hear that, Sonia said with a smile. I'm really glad you're nothing like your brother. What do you mean by that? I asked, pausing to drink some water. It means you're not like him, Sonia replied with a mischievous grin. Realizing that her words no longer hurt me, I was pleasantly surprised. It's a secret, she laughed happily. Watching Sonia like that, I felt an even stronger desire to spend more time with her to protect my current company and Sonia. With that thought, I made a firm resolve to continue working hard.